Welcome to Behind the Line, where we pull back the curtain on the challenges facing first responders and frontline workers. The work you do is unique, and so are the stresses that go with it. Join me as we tackle key issues to reduce risks for burnout, and as we work to support you in doing the job you love without sacrificing being the kind of person you want to be. Hey, frontline friends, and welcome back to Behind the Line. I'm your host, Lindsay Faas. If you're new to Behind the Line, what you should know about me is that I'm a clinical counselor specializing in trauma therapy. And after years working with first responders and frontline workers around issues like burnout, compassion fatigue, PTSD, and related OSIs, I've become a passionate wellness advocate and educator for those who sacrifice so much for our communities out there on the front lines. Behind the Line is a place for us to talk about the real life behind the scenes challenges facing you on the front lines. I created this podcast with the hope of bringing easy access to skills for wellness, allowing you to find greater sustainability both on the job and off. I'm so glad you're joining me today as I chat with nurse and author T.C. Randall. T.C. Randall was an emergency room nurse for 14 years. He worked in one of Canada's busiest ERs, located in British Columbia. 3 years ago, he was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress and has been unable to work since then. His book, The View from the Wrong Side of the Day, was published 1 year ago. Since then, he's been working diligently to further his writing career. He's also an advocate for better access to mental health for healthcare workers, which leads us into this conversation about broken systems, daring leadership, and practical changes to transform the system from the inside out. Now, I have to tell you, I met TC by email. He introduced himself to me and sent me a copy of his book. And when I got the chance to read it, I laughed so many times throughout the course of this book because it's such an accurate reflection of what it feels like to be in crisis and emergency work. And I think that there's so many translations, whether it's just to healthcare or across to other first response and frontline work. I think it really echoes a lot of the things that I hear from many of the clients that I see and serve who do first response and frontline work. I'd really recommend the book. Again, it's called The View from the Wrong Side of the Day, and we're going to post a link to it in the show notes today. Let's get started with our interview. All right. Welcome, TC. I'm so glad that you're here to join us. And I was hoping that, I got to read your book. I got to get a bit of an inside view about your background and some of your story. But for those who haven't had a chance to do that yet, I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, what led you to the work that you do as an ER nurse, and a bit of your story.
My name's T.C. Randall. That's a pseudonym, obviously, so I won't go into my real name here, but I started out in nursing, and I entered nursing school in 2002. I was already in my 30s at that point, so it was a second career for me. It was actually watching the series ER that sort of inspired me to go into nursing, especially Juliana Margulies' character.
Yeah.
Nurse Hathaway was one of my heroes. And it was unusual because I actually went into nursing school knowing exactly where I wanted to work. That was, they kept saying, keep your mind open. That was sort of the message we got in nursing school.
Right.
There's so many areas to work, and it's like, no, I know where I want to work.
I am determined. It's the
Yes.
ER for me. Yeah.
And I was a bit unusual too in the fact that I was one of the first in BC to go straight from nursing school into the ER, with a very short gap in between there. Up until then, it was sort of encouraged that you spend a few years working the wards in the hospital and then just to gain some experience and then transfer down to the ER. So it was quite a unusual experience to go straight into the ER. But it all sort of fell into place. So
yeah, that's cool. Well, and I can imagine that there's some of the gradual entry pieces of having some experience on the wards first or in other areas that maybe has some preparedness pieces for the ER or other departments like that.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's like trade-offs for the fact that you started so quickly into the ER?
I think because there have actually been studies done on this that show
Hmm.
that it's actually there's pluses and minuses.
Right.
One of the pluses is that they found is that because ER nursing is so unique, oftentimes nurses who come from the wards have difficulty making the adjustment because they've
Sure.
gotten used to a certain structure.
Right. And the pace would be super different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And certainly, I think I mentioned in the book the nurse that had the greatest difficulty
Yeah.
doing the ER course was a nurse who had like 15 years experience on the floor and
Yeah.
had a hard time making the transition.
Totally.
So, but I definitely think the hospital where I started out certainly did not have the structure to facilitate that.
Hmm.
There wasn't enough um, experienced support to
Yeah.
make the transition. Certainly, the place I ended up working, there was it was a larger department, there was a larger staff pool, so the mentoring piece was there in a much stronger way.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to do it.
Yeah. That's fair.
Yeah,
Well, and that is like a significant factor, right? The support pieces we have in place
yeah,
to help facilitate some of that adjustment and transition and
yeah.
learning and growing. Yeah, fair. So tell us a little bit about where things are at for you now.
Well, right now, I've been I've been in therapy for 3 years.
Mhm.
Certainly, I I I we'll talk about this maybe a bit later, but certainly I think I was in the wrong kind of therapy for the first 2 years, which is
Yeah.
why it's taken so long.
Yeah.
After doing several months now of therapy that is more geared towards my condition,
Hmm.
I certainly feel improved.
Yeah.
Uh, it's not gone away, it's managed,
Hmm.
which is a different beast altogether.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
It's I've had to learn how to recognize when my anxiety is starting to go up and develop tools to sort of keep it from getting away from me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a much different approach.
Hmm. Yeah. Fair. Fair. So you've been off work now for how long?
3 years on and
For
off.
3 years, on and
I
off.
did go back. I went back, and we did a return to work early on in the process, which didn't
Yeah.
work
Yeah.
because I was basically I was in a different area, but many of the same parameters were in place, so
Totally.
it didn't work. Um,
Hmm.
and then when COVID first started, I had a job for a couple of months where I was teaching other nurses about COVID. So,
Okay.
yeah, that was interesting work, but it didn't go on for very long. So,
Yeah, fair enough. Well, and I know that kind of in this process of being off work, you've spent your time writing a book about
yes,
what that experience has been like for you and the process of how you got to where you are right now, struggling with some of the pieces connected to
yeah,
PTSD, and some of the reflections about what kind of built in your world around that as it relates to your work. And so, like I said, I did get a chance to read your book, The View from the Wrong Side of the Day, a story about nursing PTSD and other shenanigans, which I love that you use the word shenanigans in a book title. That's fantastic. Um, you actually have a lot of chapter titles that I giggled at every single time because they were just super good and random. And I love that one of the things you said early in the book is that you kind of shape this frame of reference for the reader about how to prepare for reading what you've written,
yeah,
and you include this piece about how part like the reader will notice that it's kind of disjointed in different ways and in different places, and that you've left it like that deliberately because it feels like a reflection of how your brain is
Yeah.
working. And it feels like it kind of takes the reader along for the ride of how a brain with PTSD thinks and experiences and reflects and processes. And when I first read that, I kind of went, oh, I'm super interested about what that's going to look like as I continue to read, because I literally work with PTSD all day long.
Yeah.
It's what I've done my entire career. And so it was really, I mean, fun is probably the wrong word to use for the average person, but as a trauma therapist, really fun to get to walk alongside that. And the whole time I'm reading it, I remember thinking, oh yeah, that's totally how my clients' brains work. This is totally how they talk about things. And it is disjointed, and it is hard to have like a cohesive narrative
Yes.
that feels like it goes from like beginning, middle to end.
Yeah.
There are these
Things
little like
things are
squirrel
not
like
linear.
right? They're not. It was so good to have that. I actually really enjoyed how you did that.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed and appreciated that you kind of front loaded that and left that as just a part of the experience of
Yes.
reading your book. And so I know that your story does include dealing with PTSD related to workplace trauma and stress. And I wonder a little bit if you can share a bit more about that experience. So, how that developed for you, the factors you feel like the system contributed, some of those pieces.
Yeah, so I think first off, my story is somewhat common, I think, in healthcare, but it's also there are unique qualities to it just because of where I worked. And, I don't want to go too much into detail about where that was, but
Mm-hmm.
the hospital I worked in was rather unique in terms of how busy it was and the structure that was in place at the time. In healthcare, we've sort of set up this structure where labor is seen as sort of an expendable piece,
Yeah.
where it's become uh, certainly it's the biggest expense in healthcare is paying for the people, but I think it's seen as an expense that we can cut out,
Yeah.
which is very dangerous, I think.
Totally.
And it's made working in healthcare a very particularly hazardous environment when it comes to mental health.
Yeah.
We're consistently overloaded. In the ER where I worked, in the sort of critical area, uh, we were supposed to have 4 patients per person, per nurse.
Right. Yeah.
And we went through a period where we had up to 8. So that's
Yeah.
twice the recommended
Totally.
nurse to patient ratio. Um, the hospital itself was consistently running at 140% capacity,
Yeah.
right? So we had people shoved in every corner of, broom closets, sunrooms, anywhere where they could think to stick people, they were.
Yes.
We'd have inpatients sitting in the ER for 2-3 days at a time,
Mm-hmm.
particularly if they had to go to particular areas like telemetry or something like that, where there's a finite sort of amount of beds.
Yeah.
Um, and all that really sort of uh, created an atmosphere where the nurses who were toiling in that environment were stressed every single day,
Yeah.
right? There were days when I literally probably couldn't have picked out my inpatients from a lineup at the end of a day, right? My
Yeah.
entire interaction with them would be, peeking my head in the door twice a day and making sure they're still
Right.
alive. And that was
Right.
about it. The nature of the emergency department is that the the emergency gets the attention, right? So new people are always our priority when we're working there, and but at the same time, at the end of the day, when you're leaving work, and it's a peculiar thing, I think, to anybody who works in that sort of uh, career, be it
Mm-hmm.
healthcare, the military, police, etc.
Yeah.
We have this sort of perfectionist
Yeah.
ideal that we hold to. So at the end of the day, it's never your successes that you're taking home with you, it's always the failures. And
Totally.
when you're leaving work at the end of the day going, I don't even remember if I talked to that person throughout the whole day,
Yeah.
that's what you're taking home with you.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
and that went on for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
It I went through about a year's period where I wasn't even sure what was happening to me. I just knew that
Yeah.
things were changing.
Yeah.
I was irritable all the time, to the point where I'd actually feel rage sometimes of the littlest
Mm-hmm.
things, and I don't
Yeah.
mean that as an exaggeration. I mean rage, right?
Yeah.
Or
Totally.
extreme sorrow, or and mood swings back and forth between the two. My
Right.
my emotional responses to things were completely out of proportion to the
Yeah.
events that were happening.
Yeah.
I was having consistent nightmares, um, and just feeling. And I had a chronic migraine for about a year as well, that
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't go away no matter what.
Yeah.
Um, and we did like CT scans and all sorts of
Right.
things
Like
trying
all of
to,
the
yeah,
things to rule out a
to
medical
try,
piece.
yeah, and couldn't find a cause. And so all these things were happening, and I knew they were happening, and yet I had no sort of words for them. Right, I didn't know what was happening to me. And um, then we had a particularly bad day, in which I was the primary nurse in several sort of back to back critical cases, and it just tipped me over the edge. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
in when we talk about trauma and post traumatic stress, everybody likes to sort of focus in on that particular day, and
Yes. The
it's
claim
sort of like,
related
oh, that's,
incident,
yes,
right?
and that's
Yeah.
when it happened. And
Yeah.
but the reality is I was sitting on the edge for a year
Yeah.
beforehand,
Yeah.
and that was just the thing that pushed me over the edge. If it hadn't have been that day, it would have been the next, or the next, or the next, right?
Right.
So it wasn't.
Yeah.
um, and I think that there's a real one of the biggest challenges throughout this process has been that people don't really understand the difference between, say, a post traumatic stress and complex post traumatic stress.
Yeah.
Um, and that's been a real challenge throughout this whole process.
So when you share that piece, the difference between post-traumatic stress and complex post-traumatic stress, where do you feel like you fit in that, and what differentiates those for you?
So for me, the I'm definitely on the complex post traumatic stress side,
Yeah.
because even though the events of that day did push me over the edge, I was already there,
Yeah.
and it stemmed from this constant feeling of being vulnerable, being unsafe, being um, unable to sort of control my environment or have any
Yeah.
sort of meaningful um, way of creating a space that was safe for me and my patients.
Right. There's like limited agency.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the, um, but because the agencies that are designed to help in
Yeah.
this are very much geared towards regular post traumatic stress.
Totally.
Um, like I mentioned at the beginning, I was actually through the different agencies. I was actually in therapy for regular post traumatic stress for 2 years,
Yeah.
which helped, but didn't.
Yeah.
Um, it was it was the wrong therapy.
Yeah,
And it didn't do anything to sort of aid me in getting back to any sort of meaningful employment or life or
totally.
anything else.
Totally. Yeah. Well, and you're right. Like, I think when I talk with people about the idea of PTSD, like, certainly there are experiences that lead to PTSD that are, the one off things. It's a car accident
Yeah,
or, witnessing something traumatic or whatever. And we can have people who have had very few other bad things happen in their whole entire lives where that one thing very quickly erodes their ability to feel safe, usually in pretty specific contexts. Like, I feel unsafe when I'm driving after I've had a car accident, things like that. The treatment protocol around that looks quite different than when we're dealing with something that is really persistent,
yeah,
right? And one of the realities is that work like what you do as an ER nurse, and I think work like what a lot of first responders and frontline workers do, is a little bit like Chinese water torture. Like, it's not any
yeah,
one drop that is the like insurmountable thing. It's the accumulation and the wear of that just, it's crazy making, and it's hard to feel any power over it. Like, no matter how hard I try, I can't make it stop dripping,
yeah,
right? And so there's this limited sense of power control over our lives. And when we're spending, 12 hours a day on our rotation in that, it's not okay. Like, we're not okay as people to feel that not in control for that much time
yeah,
every day. It's just
yeah,
not how we're wired, right? Which is why I often say, like, the reality is no one comes out of these kinds of jobs unscathed. Like, there's no version of reality where you actually can. The human body is not wired to do these things well long term without any amount of support.
yeah. And I also think that, to go back to your Chinese water torture analogy,
Yeah,
that there's a big piece of that when it's your employer who's responsible for the torture, right? So the people you
totally.
feel should be at least protecting and supporting you in that role are not.
Yeah,
And I think that's common true too across the board in all these professions.
totally.
Is that
Totally.
once you've sort of um, once your youthfulness is sort of in question or at an end, it's
Hmm.
there's very little support from the people above you.
Yeah.
I remember one particular day when it was in the news that our hospital was holding patients in the hallways and things like that,
Mm.
and management actually went on the news and said, no, that's a lie. uh, and
Wow.
and we were watching this as I was looking around, and there were like 6 patients in our hallway, right? And when you
Right.
feel that sort of lack of uh, support and lack of acknowledgement of what you're going
Hmm.
through from the people who are supposed to have your back,
Yeah.
um, that letdown when you're already facing a environment where you don't feel safe
Yeah.
is it quadruples the impact of it.
Totally. Well, and it's that piece, right, of like, we want to perceive that our employer and manager and supervisor and whoever else is kind of involved in that upper
Yeah,
level of system, um, we want to believe that we get to expect that they have our back. And
yeah,
I think that's one of the very unfortunate misconceptions about the work, is that when we walk in with that expectation, we almost set ourselves up for the disappointment of the fact that we're going to see over and over again that that's not the case. And one of the things I think we've been talking about in this series, following Brené Brown's work, is this idea that we have to value people. Like, if we don't value the people who are doing the work, we run out of them. Like, we
yes,
burn them out. And
yeah,
then how are we further along? So, like, now your hospital has lost someone who has vast experience and wisdom as a result of that experience, and they're going to refill that position with someone who's like brand new and has no idea, and how are they better off as a result of that? So it's like this
Yeah.
lack of investment into something that actually would be more fiscally responsible
Yeah.
and more effective in terms of service and care, but we are too busy just doing the runaround to
Yeah.
actually invest care in people. So in this series that we've been doing, we've been talking about this idea of revolutionizing the system by creating a group of people who have an interest in becoming that type of leader, and who, you know, as they grow into their roles over time and increase their leadership capacities within their environments, wherever that might be, that they would have the ability to create influence by being the kind of leaders who give a crap about the people who do the work,
Yeah.
right? Because the challenge is, and I say this a lot on the show, is that your job is hard enough. Like the job of treating patients is hard enough. Like that should just be the hardest part of your day. And what's really unfortunate is in a lot of these systems, whether it's, you know, a health profession or social services or law enforcement or corrections or whatever, is that that's actually not the hardest part of most people's day. It's this like weird awareness that the people above me aren't actually supportive to me while I also do a job that's really hard.
Yes. And I think it even goes beyond that, because in some ways it's, my job is hard enough. Please don't make it harder. Right?
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
and I think you really hit the nail on the head in that one of the things I talk about in the book is that whole fiscal responsibility piece, that
Yeah,
the so-called fiscal responsibility that we practice ends up costing us way more than
totally.
if we actually designed a system that was um, built around what I call like the worst case scenario, right?
Yeah,
We spend, we issue these budgets and go, oh look, we're coming in $20 million less than last year, and everybody goes, oh look at that, and we're saving money, and then at the end, and it looks good on paper, and then at the end of the fiscal year, it's like, oh, we're $400 million over budget.
totally.
Right?
Because our
And
expectations are unreasonable.
yes, and
Yeah,
we end up, instead of adequate staffing, we end up paying X amount of dollars in overtime,
yeah,
um, and all these other factors that come into it, right?
totally.
When we talk about, one of the examples I brought up in the book was the example of mental health spending. We know that for every dollar spent in mental health, we save $10,
Yeah,
but there's a public perception that that's not worth pursuing, so we don't, and we end up
totally.
spending way more in the long run to
Yeah,
deal with a problem that we could have dealt with way back. Um,
yeah.
there's a real lack, I think, in healthcare right now of proactive thinking.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that came up at our hospital was this was an influx of people from um, the lower mainland. And
Mm-hmm.
we all knew it was coming. It was in the newspapers,
Yeah.
but nobody thought to, hey, maybe we should have a plan for this. Right?
Yes.
It was just like, well, let's see what happens. And of
Yeah,
course,
totally.
disaster happened.
Yeah.
Um, like I, we went through, we've always been a busy hospital, but we used to go through a period during, say, the summer months when our numbers would be lower and everybody sort of got some breathing room. And then we got
Yeah.
this huge influx of population, particularly seniors. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and we went from, having normal ups and downs to being at 140% capacity for 2 years. There
Yeah.
was, and without respite, right? There was
Yes.
no breathing room for the staff. It was
Totally.
just every day.
Yeah. Slammed.
Um, I remember once, because I used to do uh, charge nurse duties in the ER quite frequently. And about 6 months before I went off work, I told them, no, I won't do it anymore. I just flat out refused because there's no support. There's no, you have all this responsibility without any of the authority to do anything about it. And all people do all day is tell you what they can't do to help you. Right? And
which is crazy making.
And it's, like, oh, I need to get the admitted patients out of the emergency room. Oh, sorry, we can't help you. It's not the answer you need. And I remember once standing up at the end of, because twice a day we had meetings with all the charge nurses to discuss, flow in the hospital and things like that.
Right.
And it was sort of like trying to do a Rubik's Cube, right? Like we'd sit there for half an hour and it'd be like, okay, if we move these 3 patients over here and then those 2 patients over there, and then we move these patients over here and put those over there, and then we'll have this space over here available. And it was like that every day. And I remember
like the great shuffle.
And somehow it was expected to make room if you just put people, the same amount of people in different spots would somehow open space. But I remember standing up at the end of one meeting and just going, okay, so that's great that we've made it through today. What's our plan for next week? And everybody just stared at me.
Totally.
Right? There was no forward thinking. There was no even concept that, hey, maybe we should get ahead of this. Maybe we need to be proactive, and maybe we need to start having a plan that is not just about today.
Totally. Well, and you're like, I think that goes on so many levels, right? Like you're right, so much about the proactivity that could happen around, the patients that we're having an influx in, and where do we put them and what do we do and how do we staff more effectively and whatever. I think there's also this huge piece about the proactivity and helping people to recognize how they're doing in the midst of it. Like, I wish that was part of your guys' training more, is how to self-assess whether I'm actually okay. Because I think that one of the challenges I face on my side of things is that I get people when they are so far down that rabbit hole. And I work with groups like the insurance providers and, compensation groups and things like that, who are in that rush to like, okay, how quickly can we get this person back to work? And I kind of have this position of like, if you didn't hand them to me so freaking broken, I probably could have done this a lot quicker. But here we are. So it's gonna take a while, and you're gonna have to be okay with that, because I'm like, I can do a lot of great things, but I'm not a miracle worker. And the challenge is that I think people who are helpers by nature are really good at assessing everyone else's needs, but not particularly great at assessing their own. And if they're not given training in how to go about doing that, and when they need to, like the fact that that has to happen on a semi-consistent basis, to have like these check-in points with myself, if that's not built into something for people, it will not happen until it is so far down the road that we are in that space where we can't function. And that is so much harder to come back from than if we had some of the proactive preventative care way earlier in the process. Right. Which is part of why, like, genuinely, it's exactly why this podcast exists. It's exactly why I made the indicators checklist that I made and the course that I created, because I found that I was having this version of a conversation 5 times a day, 5 days a week, feeling like I want to pull my hair out, because why aren't we just caring for people better, that we can prevent them from needing this amount of care from someone like me? And why isn't that being built into workplace systems? Why isn't that part of continuing ed for everybody? Why isn't that part of, in-service trainings? Why isn't this a thing and it makes me crazy.
Yes,
This
and
is what I
I
need my own
and I
therapy
and I
for.
think that's the other piece is the culture within nursing needs to change as well, right? There is
Yeah,
that sort of mindset that we're there for the patient, so we tend to forget about our own needs. And like I said
totally.
right at the beginning of this interview, I went through a year where I didn't even know. I knew something was wrong, but I
Yeah, but
but
how do I
you
name
you
it?
get used to this idea that, oh, I'm a nurse, so I
Yeah,
should just put it, just stuff it down and it'll go away.
yeah,
And of course it didn't, which
totally.
is how I ended up here. But
Yeah,
there is that mindset and it's still very strong. I think COVID has changed it quite a bit. I think that
yeah.
conversation is now really coming up, but it's still in the early stages and it's something that
Hmm.
needs to move further along. One of the things that I did, um, one of my plans
Hmm.
is to, uh, I want to actually start a foundation that
Mm.
goes around and talks to nurses and nursing students about this.
Yeah,
I actually did a talk a while ago at the college I graduated from,
yeah.
and the response was immediate. Right, like
Hmm.
the I was told by one of the instructors later on after I'd given the talk that the instructors were busy for the rest of the day talking to students about their experiences because every
Yeah,
student suddenly was like, wait a sec, I have something I want to talk about.
totally,
and
totally.
um, and if that's going on with students, it's going on with regular nurses as well. But
Yeah,
we don't talk about it. We just shove it
totally.
down, and that and it just builds up and builds up, and it does get worse and worse until
Yeah,
um, when I went off work, it wasn't a case of that I recognized what was wrong with me. It was a case of I couldn't go in.
yeah,
Right, I got to
yeah.
work and couldn't go in the door,
Right. Like it just
and
absolutely shuts down function.
yeah,
Yeah,
and it was uh, it was a humbling experience.
yeah,
Luckily, my nursing experience was such that I recognized what it was because I thought at first I was having a heart attack on the steps.
yeah,
I was like, no, this is a
totally.
panic attack. But um, it was a very unique experience.
Yeah,
Um, I really think we need to, there needs to be a realistic structure in place for nurses where it's like, no, you need to talk about this,
hmm,
right?
yeah,
And to, one of the hardest things too is after you have this breakdown, the resources that are available to you are sort of scattered and it's not really clear where they
yeah,
are um, and when you're in this place where your brain is basically already shut off trying to go through
yeah.
this process of getting to the next step becomes its own
Yes,
traumatizing process, right? Where it's like, I
100%.
don't understand, I don't understand, right?
Yeah,
And like I remember calling up just after I went off work and trying to see somebody professionally
hmm,
because I was told it would be months through my claim process to see somebody.
right.
And it was 3 months before they set me up.
Yeah,
Um, for somebody in an acute mental health crisis is
right.
rather a long time.
It's a long time.
and but it was better than the year I was
Yeah,
told it would take to get in to see a psychologist if I booked on my own,
yeah,
right? Like people are,
yeah,
oh, we can fit you in next Christmas,
right.
right? And that,
Yeah,
so that access to the system
yeah,
is a very big piece as well.
totally. Well, and the information about where you even start
Yeah,
as a consumer of those services is super tricky. Like I think here we have how often do I get asked the difference between me as a counselor and a psychologist and a psychiatrist? Like basic information, like who
Yeah.
does what and who you see about what thing seems scattered. I've had GPs who have asked me what I am compared to like what makes me different than a psychologist. And I'm going, you don't know the difference. How are you explaining that to your patients who you're then
Yeah.
referring to those services? And that's super tricky, right? Like there's just a lot of pieces that are kind of broken in that system for sure. And
Yeah.
the other piece is that, things um compensation groups and insurance companies and things like that have access to a pool of providers, but within that provider group, they don't necessarily have the person who does the right thing that gets sent that file.
Yeah.
So, I've had so many clients that are sent to me through those kinds of insurance providers where they've seen 3 or 4 other therapists before they get to me, and they tell me about those experiences and how they actually made things so much worse. And then they find that suddenly we're doing trauma therapy because that's what I do. And it's such a different experience compared to what they've had up until that point. But it's hard to get in. Like, it's hard to get into trusting that this is going to be different because I've already had these experiences that tell me that this just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right.
And I also find, like I found from a structural point of view too, there's a real reluctance um, to talk about post-traumatic stress as it applies to healthcare providers.
Yeah.
The number of times I've been
Yeah.
told, not bluntly, but politely, to shut up from different groups
Yes.
is quite
Mhm.
phenomenal, and it astounds me that we're
Yeah.
still in that sort of mindset where it's like, oh no, healthcare is a wonderful profession and we don't want to talk about anything negative, right? Yeah. Yeah, we can't even prepare the people coming into the profession to be open to talking about it, or to be, and for
Totally.
nurses that are working, to be able to put a label to what they're feeling, which is super
Yeah.
important too. About a year after I went off, what inspired me actually to write the book
Yeah.
was that I had been talking about it, and trying to get changes made within the system for a year, and then 2 more of my colleagues went off with the same symptoms. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so writing the book was kind of like a public shaming in a way to say,
Yes.
okay, if you won't listen to me, now I'm going to go and sort of,
Right. I'm going to find a
expose
different
this.
way of doing this.
But I
Yeah.
remember talking to one of the colleagues who went off work, and he didn't even know what was wrong with him. He was in the same sort,
Mm.
where he's like, I'm crazy. I don't know why, but I'm crazy. I'm being able to
Yeah.
say, no, this is normal. This is what it is. This is why you're feeling the way you're
Totally.
feeling, was huge for him,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
um, that doesn't exist for the majority of people going off. It's like,
Totally.
what's wrong with me? All
Yeah.
I know is I'm uptight all the time.
Yeah.
Right?
Totally. Totally. And I don't know how to define this.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and you're right. Like we need to do better at educating about what we're getting ourselves into.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is the culture contributes, right? So, I remember when I was in grad school, having professors that would say, make sure that you take care of yourself, make sure that you prioritize you. And it was really great lip service, but then you
Yeah.
would watch them and they're not doing any of it. And so you get this catch 22 in your brain where you're like, right, so we say good things like take care of ourselves, but what we actually do is run ourselves ragged trying to make sure that everybody else is taken care of and okay, and we do that to our own detriment. Got it. That's what we do. That's what this is about, right?
Yes.
And so we talk about things like vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, and we talk a good game, but whether it comes to actually doing it or not is a whole different thing. And the reality is my own experience was what then working, my first job was in a center for domestic violence and sexual assault survivors, and it was nonprofit, government funded. And that was, again, very much the thing. We pay lip service to like, make sure you're taking care of yourself, make sure you do the things. But then as soon as you're like, I think I need to reduce my caseload by just 1 or 2 a week to manage myself a bit better for a little bit, no way. We need you to actually take 3 more, right?
Yeah.
Like there's just no room for it to be held well.
Yeah.
And so when we don't recognize and value the people who are doing the work, we get into this place where we burn them out so badly that we just lose them altogether, which makes no sense, again, from this like fiscally responsible position where now
Yeah.
your employer is probably paying for your insurance premium at a higher rate while you're off for 3 years, while also having to employ someone who fills your position. How does that make more sense?
Yeah. And
Like it's crazy making.
it also, I think what happened in our ER was we hit a tipping point where senior staff were retiring or leaving to go to
Yeah.
other areas, which put more pressure on the senior staff that were there. So some of them left, and it just, until we hit a point where the ratio of new staff coming in to old staff that were there was huge.
Yeah.
And then, so when you're working in that environment and it's getting busier and busier, guess who that new burden falls upon? It falls upon the few
that are
people
left.
that you have left. And I
Yeah.
found that every day where it's like a new patient comes into the ER and it's like, oh, who are we going to give it to? The guy who's got 14 years experience but already has 7 patients, or the new guy who's
Right.
barely coping with 4?
Right. Well, and even if we give it to the new guy, who's the new guy going to come to when he's stumped?
Yes.
Right. So, like, yeah, the guy 14 years might even hit his ratio of patients, right? I might only have 4 patients, but I actually feel like I've got 20 because there's 3 other new staff who
Yeah.
each have 4 patients, and I'm
Yeah,
helping all of them because they can't hack it
yes.
at this stage without support.
Yeah.
But then who supports the next guy up?
Yeah.
That's the hard part, right? Like the support only goes so far.
Yeah. And one of the things that, on the day that I actually went off work, I was actually, one of the reasons why I was called in on all the traumas that were coming in was because I was in a mentoring role. On that day, I was actually orienting a new staff member, and as a result, I was extra. Well, no, I'm not extra. I'm already performing a job.
Totally.
So I had to abandon this new person who's, struggling in her own way to sort of get through the day. So that I could deal with these things that there was nobody else to deal with.
Okay, so here's my curiosity. We've done a really good job, I think, of identifying I want to say trashing.
Yeah.
I want to say we've done a good job of trashing the system. I'm trying to find a way to put that a little bit nicer. So I feel like we've done a good job of identifying the concerns and the challenges and the shortcomings of the system. Recognizing that the audience that we have for this podcast are people who I think actually really genuinely want to make a difference for the people they serve in their roles that they're in right now, but also for this system as a whole. What would you hope a future generation of leaders would learn as a result of some of your experiences and take forward if they were to be in a position where they had more significant influence?
I think it's a twofold question, and I think we've touched on both parts. The first one is cultural. We need to start approaching nurses and future nurses, and not to, I shouldn't even say nurses, anybody coming into this profession, so doctors, lab techs, whoever they happen to be, anybody coming into a healthcare profession needs to be set up with the tools that they need to succeed. And that means that we need to start having a conversation about mental health. Right from the start, we need to have clear procedures in place for people to follow when they're in difficulty. We need to have a conversation about here's how to avoid burnout, here's what to look for in terms of burnout. And we need to make all that information readily accessible so that when people are in crisis, they're not struggling to muddle through it all.
Totally.
And I think the other piece is structural. We need to stop this idea that fiscal responsibility means lowballing all the time. We
Yes.
need to have a system in place that, and I don't think it involves spending more money. I think it involves spending the money that we have better,
Hmm.
smarter.
Yeah.
We need to, as I said, plan for that worst case scenario
Yeah.
so that we have those structures in place. We have
Yeah.
sufficient staff in place. We have the resources that they need in place,
Yeah.
right? I think COVID really highlighted that problem of, oh, let's just spend the least amount we can at the beginning of the
Yeah.
year and then wait for the fallout at the end of the year. Right?
Totally.
And all of a sudden
Totally.
this crisis comes along and we're, oh, we don't have this, we don't have that, we don't have the other thing, right?
Yeah.
We need to plan for that ahead of time. We need to be proactive about it. We need
Yeah.
to and these aren't things that are coming out of nowhere, right? These
Hmm.
are things that are already in place in other systems.
Yes.
One of the things that I can't remember where it is, but there was a hospital that I saw um, that actually has, it's almost like an air traffic control center in their
Mm.
hospital that does nothing but flow patients. That's their
Okay.
entire duty, right?
Wow.
Where they just do that all day. They get people home, they get people
Yeah.
to different areas when they need it, and it's reduced wait times in the ER for admitted patients by a significant amount.
Right.
So taking these ideas, we don't even have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to take these ideas that are working, that might cost a little bit in the beginning to get going, and say,
Hmm.
let's do this, let's
Yeah.
try this,
Yeah.
um, because right
Yeah.
now the way that we're doing things is not functioning. And it's not just
Totally.
functioning from a healthcare perspective, it's not functioning from a patient perspective, where it's like, who
Totally.
wants to sit in the hallway for 3 days waiting for a bed, right? Like that's
Yeah.
which delays healing, which then means that they stay in hospital for longer, which costs
Right.
us more money.
Totally. Well, and that's the piece, right? Is like it's all interconnected.
Yeah,
So, the guy at the top of the chain is saying, well, we need patient outcome and we need people in beds, but we also need them out and home. And like we want these different measurables, right? These
yeah,
different metrics that are outcome based driven pieces that management can look at and say, look, we're doing a great job. Um, and yet the decisions that are happening at that level are hindering the outcomes that they're
yeah,
demanding for, and it's the guys in between who get kind of pissed on for that inability to meet the metric,
yeah,
when it's the decisions that are happening further up the chain that really result in some of those pieces
yeah,
not functioning properly. And so it's this really tricky catch 22 of like the people that we piss on are the ones who lack the ability, right? You talked about this idea of like we don't have the authority to do the things, really. So you've put us as responsible for it, but we don't have the authority to do anything different about it.
yeah. And I
Yeah.
think that there's a lot of it has to do. We also need to. I think the beginning piece of that is changing perceptions with the public, where it's like,
Yeah.
the things that you perceive are wrong with healthcare are not necessarily the things that are wrong with healthcare,
Yeah.
and and the people in healthcare have a better idea of what those problems are. So
Yeah.
we need to stop running it as a popularity contest. I remember
Totally.
in like an RER, they built a brand new ER for us because
Hmm.
the public perception, of course, is, oh, the ER is always busy. And but what the public doesn't see is the reasons behind that, right? The
Totally.
ER is sort of like the central hub between community care and hospital care, and a lack in either one of those areas backs up into the
Yeah.
emergency room. And
Totally.
So when they built the ER, I remember one of the surgeons one day was said it's like putting a bigger funnel on the same size hose.
Yes, totally.
And to look at it from that perspective and go, okay, well, maybe we don't need to spend millions of dollars fixing this one area when we can spend maybe even a little less money fixing
Yeah.
this area and
Right.
improve the flow through.
Well,
Um,
and if we had that collaborative conversation with the
yeah,
people that are actually in the trenches doing the work and seeing the problems on all the different sides, maybe we would have a more effective way of strategizing this. But
yeah,
because we just take this top level view down and kind of look at it and go like, "Oh, I think this is the problem." Right? Then we really limit the scope of what we can do and make different.
yeah,
Mhm.
um, yeah, and I think that's so. We also need to. Um, so there needs to be a healthcare education piece. There needs to be a public education piece where we're like,
Yeah.
this is um, these are the ways you can help us.
Yeah.
And there needs to be a structural change in place
Yeah.
that recognizes these functions and recognizes the input from frontline staff.
Totally. Good summary. TC, I've so enjoyed this conversation. I feel like I got a little riled up in it, but this is what happens when I feel like we're talking about things that really matter. Like it's hard to me because I see the like catastrophic impact on a people level, and I think you're experiencing the catastrophic impact on a people level of this exact systems level broken piece. And I think I feel no remorse whatsoever for getting riled up about it, because I feel like we need people who are standing up and saying, this is enough. Like, we are losing good people to a system that's supposed to be doing good. So, what is happening here? Something is broken in this process. That this is what's happening, and it's happening so frequently, right? Like, for you to be like, and then shortly thereafter, two more of my workmates went off. I know in other industries we're seeing a ridiculous amount of suicides and attempts at suicide because of the weight of the work.
Yeah,
And I think what you've shared here today, while referencing nurses specifically at a lot of different points, actually transcends out quite a bit
yeah,
to really all public service. So I think any of the government funded, really highly bureaucratically entrenched systems, whether that's health or law enforcement or corrections, or social services. I see this a lot with social workers as well. Like, I think that there's a lot of transferability of the context of what we're talking about here and the implications that are true across the board, which is, I mean, just a whole different level of trying to recognize that we have a problem here. Right. And so I just
yeah.
super appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk with me about your experience and some of your kind of wisdom and insight into the problem.
Maybe I could point out one more thing too when we're
Yeah.
talking about this is that um, this conversation that I've been having has been going on pre-COVID, right?
Yeah.
The crisis that we're now facing with COVID is beyond imagining.
Yeah.
One of the
Whole
things
other
that
level.
being an author puts me in contact with nurses from around the world, and the crisis that is coming in terms of mental health for healthcare providers is it's beyond comprehension.
Yeah.
We're already facing, like in BC, we're looking at a shortage of 30,000 nurses in the next couple of
Yeah.
years. That was pre-COVID.
Yeah.
I'm now talking to people. There's a tidal wave of nurses who are going to be leaving the profession
Yes.
after the COVID crisis
Yep.
is done. And
Yeah, I've heard the same thing from several paramedics,
yeah,
and others that are kind of in that frontline health
yeah,
capacity, because I think everyone's committed to the like, I want to see us through this. I
yeah,
feel committed to the best of my ability to get us through this, but as soon as this is done, I'm out.
yeah. And
Yeah,
so I think that when we're having this conversation, it adds an urgency to it, because
totally.
it's the crisis that we're going to be facing a year from now is
Hmm.
tremendous.
As we wrap up for today, I want to extend my thanks once again to TC Randall for joining us. You can find some of the key points from our conversation outlined in the show notes on our podcast webpage. You'll also find a link to his book, which I highly recommend. I also want to share that next week I'll be chatting with retired RCMP Staff Sergeant Jen Pound for another conversation about transforming the system and cultivating daring leaders. Jen has been known in BC as the public face of Metro Vancouver's integrated homicide investigation team, seen regularly on the news presenting details throughout the intense gang wars in the Lower Mainland. I'm thrilled to have Jen join us and share her wisdom and insights. I hope you'll meet us back here next week for that conversation. Continue to keep up the good fight, Rebel Alliance, and until next time, stay safe.